I try not to talk about Marvel too much because, I value my mental health, but when a big one comes around, I'll dip my hand in the pot. Let me just describe what the WandaVision experience has been. The title's announced and I think it sounds pretty stupid. I joke about it in my last Marvel video as something irredeemably bad. Then a TV spot drops during the Super Bowl and I realize the classic sitcom pastiche WandaVision is playing with, and I think it looks brilliant, like the best thing Marvel's made. Then Elizabeth Olsen goes on Jimmy Kimmel, where we see an exclusive clip from WandaVision that demonstrates the sitcom approach, except it kinda sucks, riddled with laugh tracks and nothing funny, and I think, damn, this show really is gonna be irredeemably bad. Then the show comes out, and I watch the first few episodes, and the Kimmel clip works better in context, and the whole thing looks terrific and breaks the MCU mold and has all the bells and whistles to shape up to be the best thing Marvel's made. And then more episodes come out. The show reveals its hand, and just as the military organization SWORD systematically takes over Westview, New Jersey, so too does Marvel's homogeneity systematically take over the show. And just as Wanda desperately clings to the sitcom world she's constructed to avoid confronting the death she knows in her heart is real, so too did I find myself desperately clinging to every morsel of sitcom pastiche the show had left in it to avoid confronting the inevitable world of intertextuality and content I knew in my heart this would boil down to. And that's WandaVision. I really was quite into the show for the first 3 episodes. I was happy to ignore everything that's happened in continuity and watch Wanda and Vision as a happy-go-lucky couple with all the hijinks of 1950s television. Even though the show was clearly shot on state-of-the-art Arri cameras with an old-timey filter, I was impressed by the attention to detail of period recreation both in production design and in each episode's form. I think it conveys a strong understanding of the core of each era of television. There's something to be said of the show doing that classic superhero thing where it just remakes an already beloved film and slaps some superheroes onto it to convince you it's something new. But because it's so explicit in the text here, I think it gets away with it. At the same time though, I don't even think the show needs to justify being a surreal genre piece. And actually, I think it's when they do start to explain things, and things get literal, and placed in an MCU context that the whole shtick becomes underwhelming. Even in episode 2, when we see the guy in the hazmat suit, I thought things were already moving along too quickly, and I would have liked to stay in sitcom land a little longer. Oh, how naive I was. When episode 4 rolled around, my immediate thought was, this show has already jumped the shark on its 4th episode. But that got me thinking about some structural things. In a typical film, you have a status quo established that's disrupted, and the story is the tension that comes with resolving that conflict. In TV, however, the currency is status quo. Sometimes there's a normal world established that's shattered in episode 1 via inciting incident, and the wake of that is our new status quo. But sometimes shows don't even have that, and we're already in it. Point is, a show survives for as long as it can maintain this status quo, for as long as it can provide the illusion of change while keeping its characters in virtually the same situation. When it jumps the shark, that's no longer possible, and the show is dead. WandaVision, however, is not a TV show, it's a miniseries, which is to say a long, chaptered movie, and therefore it can't jump the shark. So for this reason, I think it's cool that the series plays with TV in such a meta way, because that fundamental need for a show to maintain status quo applies to Wanda's desire to maintain status quo in her own life. But this isn't a TV show, and Wanda's little TV world isn't real, so we see form informing character and story in a really unique way, the miniseries structure perfectly catering to Wanda's arc. And I don't think the miniseries has really been utilized like this. The spectrum goes from pure anthology miniseries to long movie arbitrarily broken up into hour-long chunks. That's not to say these long movies don't value episodic framing and often utilize it in very cool and unique ways, but I can't really think of a miniseries that uses episodes as episodes to establish a TV status quo and break it with a cinematic sense of consequence. So in that sense, I have to commend WandaVision. The unfortunate downside of this is that it means this status quo is the quote-unquote normal world of the miniseries film-like structure, which is to say that Monica being thrust out of the Hex is the inciting incident, and working with SWORD is the real meat of the story. This is bad because it's boring. We still follow Wanda's facade breaking and the B-plot Vision quest for answers, but for the bulk of this second act, it feels like we're watching Monica's story, which means that the homogenous Marvel stuff is too essentially a part of WandaVision's core for them to cut it out and preserve the sitcom format, aka the good stuff, and still have a show that's fundamentally the same. As I try to scrutinize it though, I feel my scrutiny only contributing to the status quo allegory. Each episode, because of the period recreation, is distinct, and you could say an episode number and people would remember what happens in it because there's such clear episodic distinction in the diegetic sitcom. But if you were to ask anyone what happened with Sword in a given episode, I imagine it would be a lot harder to recall, as this stuff is not only homogenous within the MCU, but within itself. The episodes bleed into each other on the back half, and what we really have is a long movie arbitrarily broken up into half-hour chunks. I don't like that. But again, the sense of homogenous long movie taking over fun distinct sitcom matches the plot progression. So in that sense, form informing story becomes a bit of a fallacy. If a villain in any movie were just fucking boring, and every time they showed up was a drag, you wouldn't commend the craft of the film because of how much you hated them. Unless their villainy was explicitly their boringness, but I'd say in most cases you wouldn't. There's an important distinction to be made between homogeneity and consistency, but I think what it boils down to is that Marvel's sensible desire for consistency breeds homogeneity. And this is years-old discourse at this point. The consistent red cameras, the grayish color palette, I think we're all familiar with that conversation. And those issues actually have been addressed. It seems they've transitioned from red to airy. They're color grading with a little more contrast these days, and of course Eternals being shot on 16mm is a big thing. But don't be fooled, because this new wave of Disney Plus shows WandaVision is ushering in doubles down on the brand inconsistency, and consequently the homogeneity. The clearest manifestation of this in WandaVision, outside of the sword stuff in the story, is that each sitcom episode has a different theme song that plays with the same WandaVision theme in really cool and innovative ways, committing to the sitcom framing. But then each episode is framed with just the most boring and generic Marvel Studios music and logos. Every time it cuts to the actual credits, I'm so instantly removed from what I've just watched, it feels like, not to rip off Scorsese's line, but a theme park attraction. I don't mean that in the sense that the films are mindless adrenaline rides, or that the actors are theme park employees in costumes, but more in the sense that, like, say you go to Universal Studios, and you go to the Simpsons area, and you buy a Duff beer. There's gonna be a logo reminding you that it's a Universal Studios Duff beer. And you can ignore the logo, like you can ignore these credits, in the sense that you can choose not to look at them, but that doesn't negate the fundamental sense that you're experiencing a facsimile, which makes it really hard to maintain immersion. Again, WandaVision is tricky because it's like, oh, the facsimile is the point, the facade is the point. But if that's the case, then why is the Monica origin story, the real story when you strip down the facade, so much more boring than the facade? Maybe that's the problem. Nothing as fundamental as what I'm suggesting, but just the fact that if they're gonna do a thing like that, and advertise a fake show within a fake show, the real show still has to be good. And it's not horrible. For as much as the direct explanations kind of ruin everything we're watching in sitcom land, there's still a surprisingly consistent sense of mystery at play. Unfortunately, it doesn't pay off in any satisfying way. The villain of the sword plot is the most one-dimensional placeholder, power-hungry boss in the MCU's repertoire, and Agatha isn't much better. After the second act Monica show, the series decides that Wanda is the main character after all. We get a fun little Munsters-esque theme song that also plays with the WandaVision theme, but when we get into her actual motivation, she too is just a placeholder, power-hungry, evil version of the protagonist. She seems to have had some sort of master plan that just consists of small, inconsequential inconveniences until she for some reason decides it's time to reveal herself, which leads to a full episode of just explicitly explaining stuff, and then it's time for the showdown. But in the grand scheme of things, Agatha is completely tangential to the whole story. She's just someone else who happens to be there. Vision, whose arc has been becoming sentient and distrusting of Wanda for this genuinely fucked up thing she's doing, shows up and without question starts fighting side by side with her again, which I suppose in a life or death situation still makes sense for him, but it doesn't conclude his arc at all. It plays into the central family unit, which is good, but he got so close to reckoning with what's going on and then jumped ship. He fights Mecha Vision, which boils down to a pretty surface-level discussion of Theseus' ship, and when the grief line was being memed all last week, I was a little hesitant because I thought it was pretty inoffensive, and the idea of the memory of Vision helping Wanda grieve Pietro, helping her grieve Vision himself, was pretty good, but this scene clearly strives for philosophical depth that's just not nearly fleshed out enough. And then Mecha Vision takes off, which means in the grand MCU scheme of things, Vision isn't actually dead, just like Loki and Gamora. But that's not exactly new in the world of comics. Monica, who we've dropped by now, has this cliffhanger with Evan Peters that goes nowhere, and people are upset that they teased the X-Men multiverse with him and didn't deliver. I'm not too upset about that. That's what happens when you take too much stock in that intertextuality. They of course try to have their cake and eat it, with that intertextuality contributing so much to the hype of the reveal and then flipping it on its head. But up until this point, the reveal and the character would still work without Evan Peters. The real problem is that they set up something happening with him and Monica, and it pretty much just amounts to a boner joke. The Ralph payoff was good, I guess, but they really hinted at him being a bigger character than he ended up being. Then Monica stops some bullets to save the kids, who immediately stop the bullets themselves, and she doesn't have much conclusion because, again, half of this series is using the WandaVision outfit for a Monica origin story. And Wanda doesn't really grapple with what she's done. It's awkward when everyone's looking at her, and she has some regret, but like Vision's arc, I feel like the story skipped over an important emotional beat in her sort of becoming sentient again. I feel like I was talking about some meaningful stuff for a while there, and now I'm just complaining about the finale, but I think it was a pretty awful fucking finale. Something like Watchmen, I remember being a little underwhelmed by the ending and that putting a sour taste on some stuff I really liked, but it all technically came together, and the ending doesn't worsen the individual episodes leading up to it, which were each great on their own. WandaVision started out with strong individual episodes that are still good on their own, but it devolves into a very linear story that goes nowhere. So I'd say in that case, a bad ending does retroactively make the earlier stuff worse. Think Game of Thrones. It also looks really bad. I know that's not very important, and it's a big extravaganza, so there are more ambitious special effects, but most of the show looks so good. And even when we revisit the old set in the wider aspect ratio, it looks sleek and clean. And then in the next episode we have this. People like the Scarlet Witch suit, so I'm happy for them, but I'm pretty disappointed overall, especially because I'm not a diehard MCU fan per se, but I'm also not vehemently against the movies as movies. There is the military propaganda discussion to be had, but I think they're valid blockbusters, and the vitriol with which certain kinophiles like to talk about them is just as cringe as people praising them as high art. But of course there's also discussion to be had, and discussion that has been had, about creative voice and content and the damage these movies' success does to other movies in the macro, which I agree with. And while I can say I don't want to open a can of worms, I know that just by virtue of mentioning these things, people are going to start talking about them in the comments, and other people are going to start arguing with them, and YouTube's going to see all the engagement my video's getting and pump it into the algorithm, giving WandaVision more buzz and ultimately bolstering the Marvel empire, rendering this video another cog in the machine. So I'll give WandaVision a 6 out of 10, because why not? What about you? What do you think of WandaVision? Let me know in the comments, but remember, let's take it easy. As always, like, share, comment, subscribe, follow on social media, pledge to my Patreon, links in the description. Thanks for watching. Goodbye now.